Hi, I'm Mike Wingfield. I'm a professor at the University of Pretoria, and I'm giving this presentation for the National Science and Technology Forum discussion session, which is focused on plant health. And I've been invited to give this presentation specifically because I was the recipient of the NSTF award, a special theme award on plant health. So the presentation that I've chosen to give today obviously focuses on my area of research, and that is to do with the health of trees. And the title that I've chosen is A Global Perspective on Tree Health, and then celebrating the United Nations 2020 International Year of Plant Health. To start off with a few introductory thoughts. Firstly, this presentation is to a broad audience and not to my colleagues as scientists within South Africa and in other parts of the world. So it's a broad presentation and doesn't get into specifics. I won't be dealing with details, graphs, phylogenetic trees, or any of those sorts of documents that are interesting, very interesting to scientists, but of course I'm happy to enter into side discussions on those particular issues. The other issue that I want to make is that while this presentation is about the health of trees, trees are of course plants, and much of what I will say pertains as much to other plants as it does to trees. But trees are also different. They're different to agronomic crop plants, annual plants, in one particularly important sense, and that is that they grow for very long periods of time. And that impacts very strongly on how they respond to the impact of diseases or insect pests. I also want to make the point that trees are enormously important to the health of all people on Earth, all of us, in the sense, and this is well known of course, that they provide us with the air that we breathe, the water, the clean water that we drink, the health of our soils, and they're incredibly important, and that's oftentimes forgotten, to food security. And for that reason, these two little pictures on the one side of this slide illustrate that particular point, the importance of forests to poverty alleviation and to food security. And those two pictures come from policy briefs produced by the International Union of Forestry Research Organizations. The other picture is of magnificent trees, and I love trees, and I think most people on Earth love trees. These are of ancient cedars in the high mountains of the Himalayas, particularly in Bhutan, one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And I've had the privilege to work on the health of trees in many different parts of the world, and I'll capture some examples as I proceed through this presentation. The other point that I want to make is that my presentation will not deal at all with the impacts of climate change on the health of forests. Climate change is having a dramatic effect on the health of trees and also interacts with the way that diseases and insect pests impact on trees in various parts of the world. It's a very special topic, it's an important topic, and I chose this little cartoon out of The Economist, one of the issues of Economist last year, illustrating the perhaps slightly amusing side of climate change. So I won't be talking about climate change here, that's a topic for another day. But let me then proceed to some thoughts on trees themselves and forests. What I find in talking with friends, people in the public, family members, oftentimes is people think about forests in terms of those dense forests that one sees in pictures from the northern hemisphere, the boreal forests, wall-to-wall trees, or in the tropics. But forests are much more diverse than that, of course, and those of us live in drier parts of the world must know well that forests include the savanna forests. This picture illustrates that particular point. Beautiful reticulated giraffe. For those of the audience that know giraffe will know that these are not giraffe that one would find in my home country, South Africa. These are reticulated giraffe, and they're in the northeastern part of Kenya. feeding on native trees, savanna trees there, and their lives depend, as do all the organisms that associate with them, on those trees. So forests come in many different shapes and forms and are incredibly sensitive, and that is the topic that I'm going to be addressing in my talk today. Just other areas that we encounter in trees in our lives, just to illustrate the importance of trees. We depend on trees for the beautification of the environments in which we live, and some of us are privileged to live in beautifully tree-filled environments. This picture of the magnificent Jacaranda trees in Pretoria, a picture taken outside my property in Brooklyn, here in Pretoria in South Africa. And the point I want to make here is that we need to remember that these trees somewhere in the world are components of natural forests. They've been taken out of the forest environment for our purposes, in this case for the beautification of the areas in which we live. But they are native trees somewhere else. The same is true for trees in planted forests, plantation forestry, for example. So here, to illustrate that point, Eucalyptus Plantations, these in South Africa, they are planted for fuel wood, for the production of fuel wood, for structural timber, for other wood products. Incredibly important to the economies of countries, incredibly important to industries, but also, and this is an important issue, they in many parts of the world have protected the natural forest from destruction because they provide, for instance, for example in South Africa, the timber that we don't have. So without the plantation forests in, for instance, a country such as South Africa, the natural forest would have been decimated. And moving then on to trees planted for the production of fruit, illustrated here with avocados, again to make the point that we have taken these trees from natural forests somewhere in the world, in this case the northern parts of South America, and then improved them and selected them for the production of products of importance to us. But in every case, these trees that we use in our lives for our purposes come from natural forests somewhere else in the world. And that's an important point when one considers the impact of pests and pathogens. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about mostly in this presentation. So I make a general point that pathogens, so those are microbial organisms, and pests, insect pests, have had a huge negative impact on trees in all these manifestations that I've already illustrated, and they will continue to do so. So I can illustrate this in many different ways, and again I've extracted only examples to make these points. It became obvious in the modern world that diseases and insect pests were devastating natural forests about 100 years ago, with new pests and pathogens arriving in new environments and devastating boreal forests. The example that I've chosen here is of a disease very well known in the Northern Hemisphere, not perhaps so well known to people here in South Africa and in the Southern Hemisphere, other than specialists, of course, and this is Dutch elm disease. It's a disease caused by a devastating aggressive fungus that lives in a symbiosis with an insect that feeds on trees and transmits the fungus to those trees. And in all of these cases of natural forests being devastated by alien invasive pests and pathogens, they've come from an area where they've evolved with the trees, they've been moved accidentally to other parts of the world where trees are similar, usually the same genus. They are congeners, we call them congeners, and they are naive hosts that haven't evolved with the pests and pathogens and therefore have no resistance to that invasion. And the devastation is incredible, and there's really very little that can be done about this. I'll touch also on that point going further. In the plantation situation, it's somewhat different. So pests and pathogens have had and continue to have very substantial negative impacts on plantation forestry around the world. The example that I've chosen in this case is of the plantations on the Arauca coast of Chile. Chile has a huge forestry industry and has had a huge dependence on pine forestry, particularly Pinus radiata forestry. And some years ago, trees began to die, and this species was essentially devastated and taken largely out of the commercial forestry business. Due to a disease, trees started to die. It got worse and worse. The cause wasn't known to us, and it took some time to discover the cause. And in this case, the cause was a fungus-like organism, a Phytophthora species, which caused this incredible devastation. A shocking situation, but there are many similar situations in plantation forestry around the world, and that has been a large part of the field that I've worked in through my career. In the fruit industry, same thing for all fruit trees, many different fruit tree species, many different diseases have impacted negatively on these industries. The slide that I've used here to illustrate this point is a Phytophthora root rot on avocado, a devastating disease in pretty well all the countries of the world where avocado is grown for commercial purposes. In the fruit tree situation, the problems are oftentimes dealt with through chemical control, something that's not really possible in the plantation or natural forest situation. And then finally, to take an example of street trees being devastated by pests and pathogens, a very apt example for us in South Africa at the moment, in a devastating situation with the invasion of the so-called polyphagous shothole borer, a little insect that lives in a symbiosis with a pathogenic fungus. And here you see pictures of trees devastated on roadsides, in this case Natal, but many parts of South Africa showing terrible scenes like this. So it's amazing and shocking what an invasive alien pest or pathogen can do to trees. So of course a question that arises and must be arising in your minds in listening to me speaking is, what are the drivers of this problem? And largely speaking, and we know this well today, the drivers of these invasions have to do with ourselves. So the movement of plant products and people, products and other things that people move around the world. I illustrate this in a picture, rather interesting, showing a picture of air travel around the world. This is a relatively old slide, but and putting it in this presentation, it did make me think about what it would look like today in the COVID situation where so much air travel has been curtailed. One sees similar sorts of slides for shipping around the world, and it's just one big yellow mass. The point I'm trying to make is that we move huge amounts of material around the world, and it is with that material, and particularly plant products, that these pests and pathogens are moved and cause such terrible devastation to forests, to other plant crops as well. So the question is, how important is that, and what do we know about it? Well, there have been many studies within our community on the movement of plant products and the impact. I've taken, to illustrate this point, a slide from our colleague Alberto Santini, a paper that he and his colleagues put together in 2013. They were looking particularly at Europe. He is based in Italy, and the point that they made, the key point that they made in this paper, was that since 1980, 70% of all pathogen introductions were through the trade in plant material. So that plant material in many different forms, seeds, small plants, nursery plants, and so forth. And just to comment on that particular issue, to give some perspective of how large the plant trade is, looking at some data, 2016, relatively recently, $55 billion plus $35 billion in trade in plant products. These are nursery plants, cut flowers, and so forth. So it's an enormous, enormous business, and where we become involved in trying to understand the impact of plant trade on the movement of pests and pathogens, that becomes a politically very, very complicated issue. It is highly sensitive, and of course it impacts deeply on the economies of the world. Going along the same lines to the planted forest environment, a graph from a study from Brett Hurley and our team put together in 2016, which I find incredibly interesting, going back and looking at it repeatedly. This has to do with insect pests in eucalyptus plantations around the world, going back to 1870, and one sees the data show us very clearly one pest species introduced about once every 6.5 years. And then in 1970, everything changes, and it's one pest species every 1.4 years, so a dramatic change. And one has to ask a question, why has that happened? And all evidence suggests that it is very deeply linked into the growing forestry industry in the world and the movement of plant products associated with those industries. Interesting to look at this graph and see that there's no sign of a plateau, the numbers just going up and up, and everything that I look at, and when we consider these sorts of situations, there seems to be no particular change ahead. As I've said, these plant products come in various forms, illustrated here: seed, incredibly important, an incredibly important source of insect pests and pathogens accidentally moving around the world. We have studies that illustrate that very well. In this case, if you're interested, these are Acacia crassicarpus seeds. They're being cleaned, and even in the cleaning, there's all sorts of material that goes with the seed. So pathogens and insect pests get into the seeds, physically into the seeds, but are also associated with what we think of as the bits and pieces that come with the seed, bits of petiole, lyosomes in this case, and so forth. So everything I've said sounds very negative, and I need to go to the positive side of this particular story, and I will illustrate that in this particular way. I say that application of increasingly powerful technology has, and it will continue to provide solutions to these problems. So one can think back to the very earliest forms of agriculture, to Roman times, and the understanding that there were diseases of plants, for instance, wheat, and technology, so the improvement of plants to avoid the impact of insect pests and diseases goes back a very long way. One might say, well, those technologies are relatively ancient, but they are still incredibly important, and that continues to be so. So let me illustrate that issue with a few slides. So what you see here is a picture taken from work we've been doing in northern Sumatra, and in the background, absolute devastation of one of the most important plantation tree species in the world, Acacia mangium, relatively rapidly beginning to die due to the impact of a fungal pathogen. It's also associated with an insect. It's essentially wiped out one of the most important plantation tree species in the world, this in the various parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so forth. But in the foreground, one sees eucalyptus not being affected by that disease at all. And in those eucalyptus, there are a number of varieties, so they are highly selected, highly bred varieties, and those are bred, of course, for productivity, for growth, but also to counter against the impact of pests and pathogens. To illustrate that even more vividly, a picture in this case from South Africa, two varieties. One can see these, think of these as clones of eucalyptus on the one side, and those are the black trees with lots of leaves on them, devastated by a fungal pathogen, and the other side, trees receiving huge numbers of spores of that fungal pathogen, but completely healthy. So in applying technologies such as selection of species, hybridization, and so forth, it has been possible to avoid some really important disease problems. And that will be true into the future. And I'll touch on that subject a little bit more in future slides. Biological control, particularly for insect pests, has been hugely important in terms of plantation forestry. There are many examples. I've chosen the so-called Eurasian wasp, Syrinx noctilio, to illustrate this, a wasp native to Eurasia, accidentally introduced about 100 years ago into the southern hemisphere, and it has devastated pine plantation forestry in pretty well all countries of the southern hemisphere, growing pines as non-natives. And there are great success stories in terms of dealing with that pest. It is an insect that also lives in association with a wood-destroying fungus, and I've illustrated in this slide, one sees these little worms. Those are nematodes, a parasitic nematode that infests the wasps and then renders the female sterile. So biological control, hugely important, particularly for insect pests. I'm sure that people are wondering at this particular point about chemical control. Chemical control, as I think I've already mentioned, incredibly important, particularly in terms of agronomic crops and maintaining healthy agronomic crops, wheat, soybean, and many others. In forests, that's a little bit different. Very difficult to apply chemicals to natural forest, and also environmentally very complicated. Natural forest ecosystems are very sensitive, so largely speaking, chemicals are not used in those sorts of situations. And even in plantation forestry, with the low unit value of plantation trees, expensive and difficult to apply chemicals, again, environmentally sensitive. But there are examples where chemicals have been used. I will take one quick example from work that we were have been doing just in the last few weeks. These pictures of Sambi colleagues injecting chemical into the highly threatened silver trees, Leucodendron argenteum, on the slopes of Table Mountain, in fact here in Kirstenbosch, trying to save these trees from the devastating Phytophthora root rot, which threatens their future existence. And then, of course, an important point to make is the relevance of plant quarantine, trying to manage the movement of pests and pathogens through inspection of plant material. It's a hugely difficult issue, and not particularly successful in most parts of the world because it is so difficult, because one is dealing with these huge masses of material. But in some situations it's been extremely successful, and then one example is in the treatment of wood products. So there's some big success stories there in dealing with plant material, somewhat more difficult. But still, staying on the topic of technology and the importance of technology, I have been very privileged in my career, and particularly in the latter years of my career, to work in the so-called DNA revolution, the recombinant DNA revolution, post the discovery of the structure of DNA and the application of DNA technologies into the work that we do. This has really changed everything. I've chosen this picture to illustrate the particular point. It comes from a jamboree that our team held some years ago, where we sequenced the first fungal genome in Africa, first eukaryotic genome in Africa. And thinking back on that, when I was asked to provide some funding for this work, I think the cost was around 400,000 Rand, and that would be probably less than 1,000 Rand today. But what was important about that jamboree, other than just our desire to have data of the genome of a very important tree pathogen, the so-called pitch canker fungus, was the educational opportunity for young people. And numerous of the young people that are seen in this particular photograph today are established academics in their own right, and they had the opportunity to learn these technologies, the genome sequencing technologies, early in their careers. But genome data, gene data and genome data have given us amazing tools, tremendously powerful tools, such as genetic markers, for instance, to be able to track the movement of pests and pathogens around the world. This slide illustrates a leaf disease, a leaf shoot disease of eucalyptus, a devastating disease in many parts of the southern hemisphere, with costs, enormous costs. And with these DNA marker tools, we've been in the incredibly powerful position of being able to see where the pathogen come from. This is a native pathogen. It's native in Australia, where the eucalypts are native, and the pie chart shows a lot of little pies. That means genetic diversity. Ironically, the South African pie chart, lots of diversity there, and that just illustrates the fact that this disease arrived early in terms of plantation forestry in South Africa, and we just introduced lots of the pathogen. So no quarantine. And the other little balls around the picture show single varieties or genotypes of the pathogen that have moved to other parts of the world, a large number of them out of South Africa. So these DNA-based technologies have really changed our world. The metagenomic, so-called next-generation sequencing, enabling us to detect the presence of microbes in apparently healthy tissue, in soil samples and water samples, being incredibly powerful, and has really changed our ability to deal with pest and pathogen problems across the whole plant health domain, certainly true in terms of tree health. So let me get to some final points in this presentation. This year of dealing with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has changed all of our lives. For those of us that deal in the world of plant health and that work in the fields of, for instance, microbiology, it's also, other than being a frightening year, has been absolutely fascinating. And you will have seen already that one of my banner slides is of a coronavirus, which of course is not a problem on trees, if people were wondering what that was all about. But it has been absolutely fascinating to see how this disease problem, a disease of humans, has been dealt with. And for me personally, to reflect on how similar that is to how we deal with tree health problems. And I made the point early in this presentation that trees are very much like people because they grow for a long period of time, and therefore their ability to change and to deal with an invasion from a novel pathogen is just not there. Happily, we as humans have tools that we can use that we don't have for trees. And this slide is of a few, 6 copies of the cover of The Economist in the last year. It's been remarkable. There have been at least 3 times this number of covers of The Economist, the famous magazine The Economist, illustrating aspects of the coronavirus pandemic. And also illustrating the science that has come with dealing with this problem. And that science is so similar to what we need to and what we use in terms of dealing with plant health issues. From those early days of sequencing within literally weeks the virus genome, and then being able to track it moving around the world very rapidly, to understanding variation from the early days to the very topical issue today in terms of the emergence of variants of concern, which of course impacts on our ability to deal with this disease and producing vaccines. All of those issues are exactly those technologies are the technologies that we have available to us to deal with plant health problems, with tree health problems. I've already mentioned the issue of quarantine. Think of social distancing and how we've had to deal with the quarantining of ourselves, of people, groups of people, and still having to do that. And one of these pictures shows people very actively working with plant material, digging through that, not to do with the coronavirus, but dealing with plant quarantine issues and searching for pests and pathogens. So again, very similar sorts of issues that we deal with. And then having to sift through news, through information, through data, masses of data relating to the coronavirus, the science and the non-science, the nonsense, the fake news, living in the so-called post-truth era, which for academics, for scientists, is a thought which is horrific and very difficult to understand. But all of that, again, important as we try to educate people into understanding the importance of pests and diseases and the health of plants on which we depend. And we try to illustrate this long pre-COVID in a paper in Science. It had to do with planted forests, but raised many of these issues, these same issues, and particularly calling for a global approach to dealing with these problems. What the world needs is a global strategies to deal with pests and disease problems as they impact on the health of plants, which made me think of, again, a prescient presentation piece of work by Bill Gates. In 2015, Gates wrote an article, an opinion piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, a famous medical journal. He was commenting on Ebola and hugely concerned about Ebola. He said there, the key point is that the world is not nearly as prepared for a massive epidemic as it needs to be. 2015, long before the appearance of SARS-CoV-2. He makes an important point in that conversation piece, or that opinion piece, where he says the 10,000 or so people that died from Ebola need not necessarily have died if already existing technologies had been applied. And that really is the key point that I would like to make, a calling for understanding and applying the technologies available to us to deal with tree health and plant health issues in general. Essentially, we're dealing with what we as specialists in this field, call an arms race. As entomologists and pathologists, we invoke what is often referred to as the Red Queen hypothesis. It links back to Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where the Red Queen is talking with Alice, and she says, now here you see, it takes all the running I can do to stay in the same place. And our perspective, at least my perspective of this, is our goal should not be to stay in the same place, but to be continuously improving and be ahead of the wave. We're not very good at this, but we can hope that that will be so in the future. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to taking questions.